Philip Bonner has a lovely line in his book on Swazi history. It's in the context of the Ndwandwe invasion of the Dlamini polity and King Sopuza's flight into the north. In it, he writes, Zwite's invasion shook the Ngwane state to its core. Sopuza is usually pictured in Swazi historiography as executing a tactical withdrawal to a sanctuary in the north, from the security of which he quickly reconstructed the Ngwane state. Nothing could be further from the truth. Rather than resuming a barely uninterrupted career of expansion, he was obliged to abandon the bulk of his followers to Zwide and to lead the life of a rootless refugee whom Zwide hounded further and further north. I have already discussed the harrowing nature of this flight and the political and ritual bonds it formed between Sopuza and a few of the clans that chose to throw their lot in with him. But one thing I didn't bring out, at least to my satisfaction, was the evolutionary effect that the culling process of flight would have had on the quality and the composition of the adherents. As Zwide attacked Sopuza and as he fled, the weakest and likely the least fanatical elements would have been left behind, so that the men and women that made it to Makoboi's chiefdom would have been selected for resilience and a belief in the particular destiny of that scion of the Dlamini line. There's a military analyst and writer, Kenneth Pollock, who wrote a fairly controversial book. And as just a caveat, one of the dangers of reading Pollock's book is people tend to read it and stop and then think they can pontificate about Arab military performance, which is a danger. Anyways, the book he writes is called Armies of Sand. It's very interesting, and in it he tries to figure out why Arab armies post the Second World War have so underperformed. He basically analyzes the dominant theories behind it. The idea that Arab armies adopted Soviet military doctrine and this stopped them performing well. He debunks that. Underdevelopment, he looks at that, debunks it. Politicization, he looks at that and debunks it. But the cause he finally settles on is culture. The idea here being that the dominant Arab culture is unsuited to the demands of modern warfare. In particular, combined arms operations and maneuvers. In laying this out, he also looks at the exceptions to Arab military underperformance. And so looking at Arab armies and militias that have done fairly well or overperformed. Some of the examples he looks at are the Arab Legion of 48, the Syrian commanders of 82, or Hezbollah in 2006. And he concludes that these exceptions have almost always been the result of a selection mechanism that selects people who are atypical within dominant Arab culture. They tend to be creative, intrepid, aggressive, prone to taking initiative, which is highly unusual in the culture. I see this process of self-selection and cultural fit as taking place also in Sopuza's army. If not quite in the same manner, but nevertheless a selection mechanism that would have selected for people who were highly aggressive, highly innovative, and people who knew how to take the initiative. But reading Pollock really highlighted for me the importance of selection mechanisms as driving outcomes in institutions, in particular militaries, or here the regiment system that you have in Swaziland. Of course, I do think people tend to over-index on Pollock's book, but I think if you internalize the lesson of selection mechanism, there are so many things that start to make sense. So for example, if you want to understand why the Bolsheviks so overperformed in 1917, all the way up to the early 1920s in Russia, you just have to look at the composition of the people that were members of the Bolshevik party. And so it is the same as well with the ragtag group of followers that Sopuza had by the time he gets to Makoboi's chieftaincy. These people would have been selected, again, for aggression, belief, creativity. They would have had levels of physical and psychological endurance that would have been highly unusual. At the end of that long march were gathered the most warlike members of those clans, the Matsebula, the Mdluli, the Motsa, the Hlope, the Dlamini, and other clans The original seed of Swazi nationhood was carried by those clans. We call them Bimtsabugo to distinguish them from those who were incorporated later. Emakanzambili, or in English, those found ahead. These are the original clans that are the molten core of Swazi history. When you look up lists, there are between 16 to 21. 21 sometimes because later clans who rendered extraordinary services to the monarchy and the nations were folded into the history as Bemtsabugo as well. These distinctions don't have any cachet in the modern age, but they're important again for understanding the story. At any rate, I'm mentioning this because the representatives of those clans would have filled the ranks of Sopuza's small but supremely able regiments. When Zwide finally relented and fatefully crossed the Pongola to handle his troublesome southern neighbors, Sopuza and his regiments were prepared to aggressively seize this moment of respite. As Philip Bonner tells us, he, Sopuza, regrouped his forces under the cover of Makoboyi's authority and then cut loose on his own by attacking neighboring chiefs. Within the span of a year, his power had grown to such an extent that he was even able to destroy the chiefdom of the Mkhize, which stretched from near Dlomodlomo to the vicinity of modern Babane. Makoboy's response is difficult to gauge. He may have initially tolerated Sopuza's behavior, but as the full extent of Sopuza's ambition became known, he seems to have taken the lead in a sort of backlash against his ungrateful protege. Sopuza thereupon fell back on the defensive and might have ultimately been compelled to withdraw, but he was saved a decisive trial of strength by an unexpected intervention from the south. Before I get to the intervention from the south, I'd just like to pause here for a second and reflect on this stunning turn of events. Here we have an untried chief. Let's remember that Sopuza's exploits in Eshiselweni prior to his flight are of so little account that they don't even make it into the historical record. So, an untried chief with between 300 to 500 fighting age males enrolled into the regiments, and he is the terror of the region. That they were so able to dominate their peers speaks to the prowess of these men that formed the core of regiments that are famous to this day. Punga, Mbulalazwe, Mahubula of the White Ox Tail, and many other regiments. What must it have been like to be young, in the prime of life, and the deadly warrior of a ambitious and generous chief? I'm probably romanticizing the period too much. But anyways, let's get back to the intervention from the south. Bonner tells us, since Sopuza's hasty withdrawal across the Lusutfu, the Ngwane heartland of the Eshiselweni had been the scene of turmoil and strife. Zwite's armies roamed back and forth, and its people were reduced to a state of anxious dependency, acknowledging Zwite's overlordship, but never sure that this would confer immunity from attack. In time, some degree of regrouping took place. These are the conditions that set the stage for the emergence of a peculiar arrangement in Swazi history. Most Swazis recognize and know that the Mamba clan and chief occupy an unusual place in the political dispensation of Swaziland, where they are recognized as kings in their own right, although now this is more of a symbolic nature. In fact, there is an excellent exchange in the 500-year archive in UCT's Emandulo site, where Lokwacha Mamba really highlights this unusual relationship. He recounts an event in Swazi history saying, during the Battle of Lubuya, the Mamba were present as the forces of the king. This is the Swazi king. In fact, they used to fight in all the Ngwane wars. Even King Macha, who at the time was the Mamba king, was armed and pushed ahead into battle. But the Swazi king sent him back saying he was his equal. So how do we get to this unusual place where the Swazi king recognizes the Mamba king as his equal, if only symbolically? Well, Bonner tells us that during this period where Sopuza is facing this Soto combination led by Mokoboyi, the Mamba, who occupied the transitional zone between the middle veld and the low veld around Mbelebeleni, were never really subdued. This is by the Ndwandwe forces, and soon came to be looked upon by the leaderless remnants in Eshiselweni as the natural heirs to Sopuza's power. This they declined, perhaps for fear of inviting Ndwandwe reprisals. But there were others more eager to take on that role. If you watched the first episode on Sopuza, you will likely recall that I mentioned that on coming to the throne, Sopuza faced a challenge from one of his brothers, Ngwegazi. Ngwegazi's attempt likely miscarried in part because at the time Sopuza was well established in the south, in Eshiselwe. But with Sopuza's flight from Zwide along with his adherents, a political vacuum opened up in the region, and one of his brothers, Makwekwe, attempted to step into the breach. Makwekwe wanted to aggrandize to himself the political prerogatives and powers of his brother, likely in part because he could see that Zwide was still dealing with Shaga in the south, and that Sopuza was still occupied in the north with the Soto. It seems that Makwekwe's early attempts likely succeeded. The clans in the region that had been left bereft by Sopuza's flight needed order and somebody to rally behind. But thankfully for Sopuza, the star that seems to attend many of the careers of the great Dlamini heirs intervened on his behalf in this moment. In 1819, Zwide's forces were defeated by the young warlord king, Ushaka Senzangakona. The different clans upon which Ndwandwe's suzerainty had been established, the Jele of Zwangendaba, the Komalo of Mzilikazi, the Msane of Ngaba, and the Ngumalo Gaza of Soshangan, repudiated their allegiance to the Ndwandwe after years of suffering under the Ndwandwe yoke, and fled to secure for themselves the respect and sovereignty in far-off lands that they had been so conspicuously deprived during their period of political dependency. The Battle of Mhlatuze River forever transformed the balance of power in southern Swaziland and the Pongola region. The Ndwandwes were checked and broken. Of course, they were still a political force, and even until 1826, right up until Sikunyana, Zwite's heirs defeated, they posed a threat to the Swazi, but they would never be again that invincible force that could overturn a kingdom. This reversal of Ndwandwe power was disastrous for Makwekwe. He had only just begun to usurp the political prerogatives that were rightly his brother's. Maloi, the Mamba chief at the time, does not seem to have been particularly taken with Makwekwe. He would not countenance the pretender and quickly sent a delegation to Dlomodlomo to ask Sopuza to return. And, as Bonner tells us, facing a hostile Soto combination, Sopuza was only too happy to return, and with Mamba assistance, swept Makwekwe from power. Thanks to this, and no doubt to Maloi's de facto autonomy, the Mamba were granted the ritual and military privileges which they still hold today. Maloi was permitted to raise his own regiments, to give sanctuaries to refugees from Sopuza, and to hold a version of the first fruit ceremony, all of which was tantamount to treason for anyone else. The Mamba, in effect, had become a state within a state. I think that's an excellent place to end this episode. I will focus the next episode, really the final episode, properly speaking, on the last and most famous period of Sopuza's life, the moment where you have the conquest in central and northern Swaziland proper. So the fall of the Makakula, for example, and the acquisition by Sopuza of the rain-making power that he was famed for. Anyways, I really enjoyed this episode. I hope you like, subscribe, and tune in to the next episode. Thank you.